We plan to follow up this discussion focused on the problem with a second conversation about aviation noise, this time with a focus on solutions. Before we get started, please note that we're recording this event to share with registrants. We happily have a couple hundred attendees, so we're going to keep everyone on mute to be sure we move smoothly through presentation. In the interest of time, we'll also keep our introductions for panelists brief. We will post a link to the speaker roster and program in the chat. I've already done that to provide you with details about each presenter. Also, please feel free to come and go as you need to fix a sandwich or make a cup of tea.
Thank you.
You're welcome. To begin, let's take a quick look at the agenda.
You good?
Jamie, can you share the agenda?
Oh, I don't have it to share on the screen.
Okay,
Trish.
That's fine. Then I'll just walk us through it verbally. After our welcomes and our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who we're pleased to have with us today. Thanks for making time. We will have 3 panels focused on health, community, and legal issues associated with aviation noise and pollution. We have 2 Q&A sessions on the agenda, the first following the health panel, the second following the community and legal panels. We encourage you to post questions in the chat, and we will do our very best to get to as many as we can. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arlene Bransoft, who is the honorary chair of our Quiet American Skies program. Thank you so much, Arlene.
Thank you. It's been over 45 years since I did my study on the effects of noise on children's learning when their classrooms were adjacent to the elevated train tracks. And by the 6th grade, they were nearly a year behind in reading. What was really important about that study is how quickly the New York City Transit Authority and the Board of Education abated the noise at the school so that I could go back the following year and learn that children now on the side adjacent to the tracks were reading at the same level as the children on the quiet side. It's now 45 years later, we have far more research linking noise to adverse mental and physical health effects. And I'm looking forward to the speakers today who will address the scientific link between noise and adverse health. And then we will hear from the voices of the people who are suffering from the overhead flights. And to me, their voices equal that of the research, because over the past 45 years, I have listened to many, many people talk about how much they're suffering. And as a psychologist, suffering is a key word. And then what do we do about it? I have to confess, as the wife of an attorney and the mother of 3 attorneys, I do believe in legal action. And I'm looking forward to the 3rd group of speakers who will address the issue of what we can do legally, because we may have to pursue it legally in order to quiet the skies and bring everyone a healthier, quieter environment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. And Trish. First, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our promotional partners, and you, our audience, for participating. In May, we conducted a 10-question online pilot survey on the community impacts of aviation noise and pollution. We had 1,452 responses in 2 weeks. I want to share a couple of the top-line results, and we'll have more details for you when the full analysis is conducted this summer. Just a couple of questions here. First, people affected by aviation noise are experiencing loud, penetrating, repetitive noise at low altitude, and this is happening during the night as well as during the day. The numbers on the right, just for edification, show the top 5 characteristics of exposure to aircraft noise. Second, people's health is being affected by sleep disruption, emotional distress, and physical manifestations. And again, the top 5 are right on the right. The point is that this is a serious health problem, a national public health problem. It's something we knew 50 years ago. However, many people, including policymakers, are not aware of the insidious effects of noise as well as pollution. Sleep disruption, annoyance, and other first-line reactions that we have when we're exposed to noise are simply catalysts for serious disease and conditions, ones with enormous costs for our society. Referring to aviation noise as an annoyance and using inadequate metrics trivialize the problem and will not bring us to any meaningful solutions. This conference is about connecting the dots to understand and gain clarity on the problem so that we can adequately address it. And we also need effective federal noise legislation to help us. America used to be the world's aviation leader. Working together with all stakeholders, my hope is that we can build an aviation system that not only protects those in the air, but also those on the ground. We need to bring health considerations into our policy decisions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. She is the co-chair of the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus, a national leader and a woman of many accomplishments in civil rights, women's rights, and other areas. Her leadership on aviation impacts is helping to bring this clarity that we need. Congresswoman.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here for the Quiet Communities Aviation Noise Pollution and Health Conference. As the second most senior Democrat on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, as a member of the Subcommittee on Aviation, and as the co-chair of the Quiet Skies Caucus combating aviation noise, aviation noise is one of my top priorities. Even though the District of Columbia has the most restricted airspace in the country, I hear from DC residents almost daily about the negative impact aviation noise has on their quality of life and health. That includes sleep, stress, and cardiovascular health. This Congress, I have introduced 3 bills, 3, to combat helicopter noise in DC and have co-sponsored 9 bills to combat aviation noise nationally. My bills aim to reduce helicopter noise in DC by requiring the Federal Aviation Administration to create a helicopter noise complaint sharing mechanism to submit recommendations to Congress on reducing helicopter noise in DC, and to require helicopter operators to fly at the maximum altitude permitted by the FAA in DC. This Congress, the Quiet Skies Caucus, has pushed for community representation on the Next Gen Advisory Board, FAA reviews of aviation noise standards, and an FAA aircraft noise sharing mechanism. I'm running for chair or ranking member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure next Congress, when the committee will draft the FAA reauthorization bill. The FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, which was the first 5-year FAA authorization bill since 1982, expires in fiscal year 2023. If I am chair of the committee next Congress, combating aviation noise will be a top priority in the aviation reauthorization bill. I look forward to continue to work with quiet communities to reduce aviation noise and create quieter skies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your time. I hope you can stay for a little bit. I know there's a lot going on in Washington today, but as long as you can stay.
Yeah, there is a lot, but I will stay for a little while.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks for all your work. Okay, I am going to share my screen and introduce the health panel. Okay, so our first panel today is comprised of some of the top researchers and clinicians who are concerned with aviation noise and pollution in general. I don't want to waste time going through lengthy introductions. You can read about our speakers by clicking the link in the chat to the speaker roster. We're focused today on connecting the dots between our scientific understanding of the harms of aviation noise and pollution and the experiences of community members who not only live near airports, but also away from airports, and including those in some of our most remote rural areas. We'll have time for a few questions following the panel. And first, I would like to introduce Dr. Neelakshi Huda from Tufts University. Dr. Huda has done pioneering work to advance our understanding of community and health impacts from aviation pollution. And just bear with me while I bring up her presentation. Okay, Dr. Huda, are you co-host, or Trish, could you make her co-host, please?
Jimmy, I can start. I think you can advance the slides for me. I'll say next when I need to.
Okay.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I'll talk briefly about the impact of aviation emissions on air quality and associated health effects in near airport communities today. Next slide, please. The two key points that I want to convey today are that near airport communities rank adversely on environmental justice metrics and are already environmentally burdened. The second key point is that the adverse impacts of aviation emissions and the health effects remain under-recognized, and under-recognized is the key word that I will expound on today by summarizing results from a few studies near large airports, commercial airports, and I will also show an interesting mitigation from a general aviation airport. Next slide, please. About 10% of US population lives within 10 miles of top 23 airports, and these are the airports that have greater than 10 million enplanements a year, or at least used to before COVID. So it's a large fraction of the US population that is that we're talking about in context of this research. Next slide, please. These communities or near airport communities rank higher on environmental justice metrics. Now, what do I mean by that? I took the data from EPA EJ screen, looked at the environmental justice indicators there, the environmental indicators, and I plot 4 of them here. The red bars indicate the distribution for the near airport communities, and the gray bars indicate the distribution for the entire US. And you can see how the red bars are very skewed towards higher percentile ranking in US. For example, 80% of the worst ranking US census block groups in terms of exposure to diesel PM are located within 10 miles of top 23 airports, and so on and so forth for the other risk factors. Next slide, please. There's also a higher presence of higher minority fraction in the block groups in the near airport communities. Next slide, please. Now I'll transition to the second key point, that the adverse impacts are under-recognized. And there are a few reasons as to why. Unlike noise, air pollution exposure is often not a palpable experience, so the communities experiencing them may not even be fully cognizant of the effects. And then secondly, community exposure to elevated levels of air pollution arising specifically from aircrafts or airports has been understudied and or even essentially unstudied by researchers. Most of the research focuses on near airport air pollution impacts or on the tarmac, but that is not where the air quality impacts begin and end. And I'll show how far they extend from the airport. Next slide, please. Before I show those results, I want to define an air pollutant of particular interest in this research. It's called ultrafine particles. These are particles that are smaller than 100 nanometers, and I will report them as a number count per centimeter cube, which is about the same size volume as a sugar cube. These are excellent marker of fossil fuel combustion emissions, and they are emitted in large numbers by jet planes, and hence they are the focus of our research. Next slide, please. So when we conducted measurements of ultrafine particles at LAX or near LAX or even farther away from LAX, this is what we found. This is a map of ultrafine particle concentrations, wherein the higher concentrations are shown in darker colors and lighter colors represent low concentrations. You'll see that the pattern is such that the highest concentrations are found underneath landing jet trajectories, aligning with the downwind direction. The wind at LAX blows from west-southwest. The higher concentrations can be 10-fold higher compared to the clean background near LAX, but even around 12 miles away, they were 3 or 4-fold higher than the urban background. Next slide, please. Hence, the key finding that I was going to expound on, the adverse impacts of aviation emissions on air quality extend over areas that encompass large populations, and they extend over large areas near big airports. Next slide, please. And these results have been confirmed at many other US airports as well as international airports, for example, Schiphol near Amsterdam, Heathrow near London, and more recently, SeaTac near Seattle. Next, please. A distinct particle size is associated with this impact, and as I mentioned, the highest concentrations are found under landing jet trajectories. This particle size is of interest because smaller the particles are, the deeper they penetrate into the human body. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes a study conducted near SeaTac where they found similar results, and they could distinguish aviation impacts from traffic impacts on air quality as far as 10 miles out away from the airport. Next slide, please. Here are the results from a house which was underneath a landing jet trajectory in the town of Winthrop near Logan International Airport in Boston. Until now, the results that I've shown you are ambient air concentrations or outdoor concentrations, but the impacts are not restricted to ambient air or outdoor air. The elevated air pollution penetrates the exterior of the home and can be found inside. And here are some concentrations from inside a home. The green line shows that concentration. The green line is lower than the red line, but the concentration here inside the home are approximately the same as you would measure on a really busy highway. And the orange highlight is the time when overhead flight activity was occurring. So the concentrations at that home downwind of the airport can be 10-fold higher during that overhead flight activity. Next slide, please. And this result was again confirmed at many homes around Boston area. Here I show some results from town of Chelsea, but we've detected higher concentrations as far as 7.3 kilometers away from the airport in Logan. Next slide, please. Switching gears to the health effects, adverse health conditions are prevalent at higher incident rates in near airport communities. This has been shown for a range of health impacts. The one that I want to focus on today are preterm birth and brain cancer. Next slide, please. Next, please. Opposite direction.
No, I know. Hold on. I have to I have to get out and come in again. Sorry. This is the some problems with Zoom, but we'll get there. Let's see.
I can talk without the slide, and then whenever the slide comes up, you can see the results. So based on all the
Yeah.
measurements that we did near LAX, we then combined them with a modeling effort and tried to calculate what the exposures were for mothers that were living within 15 kilometers of LAX. And we assigned those exposures for a large data set, about 175,000 mothers or pregnant people between 2008 to 2016, to understand whether or not exposure to higher ultrafine concentrations, specifically of aircraft origin, had any effect on preterm births. And we found that preterm birth rates among mothers exposed to ultrafine particles from jet exhaust were actually higher, about a 32% higher chance for those that were exposed to the highest levels of pollution compared to the lowest levels of pollution near LAX. And this work was published in 2020 in Environmental Health Perspectives by Wing and colleagues. Next slide, please. Similar models were then used to study exposure for a multi-ethnic cohort near LAX or around the LAX in Los Angeles region, and we found an association between airport-related ultrafine particles and a risk of malignant brain cancer. About a 12% increase in risk per interquartile range of exposure. So if you divide the entire subject here in 4 bins, so as you jump from one bin to the other, you go one up in interquartile range, there's a 12% increase in risk. We found that if you did this analysis, stratify that by race, for the African American subgroup that had the highest exposure, the malignant brain cancer risk was actually 30% higher for each interquartile range. Next slide, please. There's also a great comprehensive set of studies that are being conducted around Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, and I don't have time to go over them, but I thought this link would be interesting and you can explore it at your own time. Next slide, please. So research needs definitely exist around this, but simultaneously exist compelling evidence to start considering mitigation measures. And I want to show an interesting example of an effective mitigation, but not from commercial airports, but general aviation airports. And runway shortening can be a very effective mitigation strategy near GAAs. And I want to show some results on the next slide from Santa Monica Airport. It's the first airport that recently entered into a landmark consent decree with FAA that allowed it to shorten its runway by 225 meters at both ends to limit jet aircraft operations. The runway is now too short for jets. And it has pretty much almost eliminated jet aircraft traffic. We were commissioned to study air quality before and after the runway shortening, and we saw a huge decrease in particle number concentrations, as well as decrease in black carbon concentrations after the runway was shortened. Interestingly, there was no change in piston engine aircraft operations at the airport due to runway shortening, which used leaded fuel. Nonetheless, we still found large reductions in lead concentrations after the runway was shortened, because shortening essentially created this buffer that allows for enhanced dispersion where there was none. So increased distance from the newly shortened runway essentially lowered the concentrations that we were measuring at the same home before the runway was not shortened. So this is an interesting example of an effective mitigation that is possible near GAAs. Next slide, please. That is actually my last slide.
I'm sorry, Nilakshi.
Which essentially acknowledges that this part of this research was funded by NIH and IHS, but do not represent the agency's views. The views are mine. And on the slide deck, you'll also find my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions or emails. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nilakshi. I'll just quickly share the screen. Maybe you can put that information in the chat so that people have it.
Sure, I will.
Great, great. Okay. Okay. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Matthias Basner. Dr. Basner is Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. He's a leading researcher on the effects of transportation noise on sleep and health, and an advisor to the World Health Organization. Trish, can you have Dr. Basner share his screen as co-host?
I'm not sure I can do that, Jamie.
It doesn't allow me because it says I'm a participant.
You're a participant. I know, and everybody has disappeared from my participants. So I don't know technically what's happened. I do have your presentation though. So maybe I can just pull it up on the screen.
Yeah.
And that'll be the workaround.
Yep.
Okay, bear with me, please.
We're flexible.
Yeah.
So perhaps I can, start a little bit. So I've been doing research on the effects of noise on sleep and health for more than 20 years. I also have a disclaimer that I'm currently funded by the FAA and by the UK Department for Transport to conduct studies on the effects of aircraft noise on sleep. I'm also immediate past president of the International Commission on Biological Effects of Noise. And again, as the previous speaker, these are only my views and they're not representing the views of anybody else. And there we go.
Here we go.
Okay, and then you can move on to the next slide right away, please. So obviously sleep is extremely important for maintaining both physical and mental health. And here on this slide, you see all the negative things that can happen if we're not getting sufficient sleep on a chronic basis. And the red ones are like the psychological or mental health issues that one can develop. The blue ones are the physiological effects we see after sleep that is too short or disturbed, and the black ones are long-term health consequences down the road that have been associated with not getting sufficient sleep. And it's really important to mention that there's two components to sleep. One is the duration, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine suggests that adults should get at least 7 hours of sleep per 24 hours every day to prevent long-term negative health consequences and to maintain high levels of cognitive performance. But there's another component, that is the sleep being undisturbed. That is, we need continuous bouts of sleep for sleep to be recuperative. And obviously, noise is a very potent disruptor of sleep because the auditory system is monitoring our environment 24/7. That is, even while we're sleeping, it's not only looking for sound levels, but also for the content, analyzing that content. And then there's a decision made whether we are woken up or aroused by a noise event or not. Next slide, please.
I'll have to go in again.
Okay, I know that the next slide is about the World Health Organization. They published a report in 2011 on the the burden of disease of environmental noise exposure, and looking at a number of different health outcomes. There it is. And I mean, this is like more than 10 years old, and this pie chart would look very different today, especially the ischemic heart disease number would be much bigger. But you can see that sleep disturbance is a major contributor to the overall burden of disease. You can see that in the European member states alone, annually 1.6 million healthy life years are lost due to environmental noise exposure. And again, you know, the nighttime is a very sensitive period where we try to sleep and try to recuperate. So this is something that a lot of the complaints are generated during this period because it is so important. Next slide, please. And there are many ways that we can investigate how noise exposure during the night affects us. And all of these different types of studies have pros and cons. You know, you can do basic or animal research, and I'm sure that Dr. Münzel will talk about that, you know, after me. And it's great for establishing mechanisms and biologic plausibility. Obviously, the translation to humans, there are limitations there. You can do laboratory and field studies where you either expose people in the lab to noise and see what happens, or you go into the field and measure what's happening to people in their homes. And the great thing is we can make the direct connection between the noise exposure and the physiologic response during sleep. You know, obviously there is some limited ecologic validity. That is, we cannot, you know, readily generalize the findings that we do in the lab. Much more so, we can do that with findings in the field. They're like, you know, sometimes low response rate, and you know, we cannot directly assess the long-term health consequences. We can do surveys. It's great because the methodological expense is so low. But as you all know, you get like 3 surveys every day. So the response rates are increasingly low. And of course, there's a potential for response bias. And then, you know, epidemiologic studies, the great thing is they look at the health outcomes of interested directly. Those are their primary endpoints. But they are observational studies. They're not like a randomized controlled clinical trial. You know, often based on noise predictions. You know, there's long induction periods for those diseases. So there's, you know, issues around these observational studies as well. In the end, we need all these different study types to make conclusions about, you know, what are levels that are tolerable and at what point are those levels exceeded. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
It's a back and forth.
It
Yeah,
is back
so
and forth.
I think I know what the next slide is about. So, you know, there are several determinants that will determine, you know, whether we react to noise during sleep or not. I mean, okay, no, that's not the slide. Yeah, go here. Let me first tell you how we measure sleep. So, our primary interest is lies with the brain, because this is, you know, where sleep is generated. Is also, you know, the brain is profiting greatly from sleep. Once we go beyond the 16 hours awake, you will notice that you get sleepy, that your performance declines. So, you know, we put electrodes, or the gold standard for measuring sleep is polysomnography, putting electrodes on the scalp next to the eyes to measure eye movements, and on the chin muscles to measure muscle tone. And then we can differentiate different sleep stages. You know, there's wake, and then there's sleep stages S1 to S4. The higher the number, the deeper the sleep. And there's also rapid eye movement sleep. If you're woken up out of that stage, most often you can recall your dreams. And, you know, the stages differ in their recuperative value for sleep. Very important are, you know, stages S3 and S4, which is a deep sleep, and also REM sleep, and they you know, for memory consolidation and other things. Sleep is a very active mechanism. So a lot of things are happening during sleep. Specific hormones are being secreted exclusively during the night. And again, we're consolidating memories. We're actually still actively working on problems. So we do have new insights when we wake up in the morning. So it's important that this process is uninterrupted. Next slide, please. And this is just an example, us waking up from sleep. So this is somebody who is at the beginning of this 36-second period is in deep sleep. And then that person is waking up. So you see a lot of muscle artifacts in the brain waves, which are the top two channels. You can see increase in muscle tone in the EMG, and you can also see a concomitant increase in heart rate. So there's often a reaction of the autonomic nervous system accompanied with these awakenings. It also increases in blood pressure, and it's important that blood pressure goes down during the night because that recuperates our cardiovascular system and keeps that healthy in the long run. The problem we are having is that we have around 25 of those awakenings every night. So the question is, what does it mean if we have one additional awakening induced by noise, for example? So that just makes it hard for us, because these awakenings or reactions we see induced by noise during the night are not specific for noise. There's lots of other reasons that can evoke these reactions. Next slide, please. So how does this work? What are the predictors whether we will and to what extent we will react to the noise? First and foremost, obviously, it's the noise event itself. During the night, we often have intermittent noise that are spaced by pauses in noise exposure. And of course, it depends on how loud is the noise event, what is the spectral composition, but also the content, how meaningful is that for us. And there are individual moderators, like how old are we, how sensitive are we to noise, and situational moderators. How much sleep has already elapsed? Are we in a deep sleep stage? It's very tough to wake us up out of a deep sleep. Or are we in a superficial sleep stage, etc. And then next slide. This will determine the physiological reactions to single noise event. We will have, brief awakenings, longer awakenings, changes in sleep stages and structure, body movements, etc. Next slide. And this accumulated across the night means, our sleep will be somewhat shorter. We will have less deep sleep, less REM sleep, and more time spent awake. And next slide. And all of that just means that, if we have these changes to a relevant degree, we will see decreases in performance. We will be more sleepy during the day. That has all been shown in laboratory and field studies. And at least the hypothesis is, if this continues over years, that this can contribute to long-term negative health outcomes like high blood pressure, other cardiovascular disease endpoints. But more and more, because there's an inflammatory process involved, also other endpoints like obesity, increased cancer risk, or even neurodegenerative disease. Next slide, please. And we're stuck again. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the next one. I could actually look it up in my slide set.
That's bad.
Yeah. So the World Health Organization recently updated the environmental noise guidelines, and there were a couple of systematic reviews performed to inform that update. And my colleague Sarah McGuire and I, we performed that review for the effects of noise on sleep. Next slide. And typically what we try to do is develop so-called exposure-response relationships, where you can see the magnitude of the effect depending on the noise exposure. This is looking at a subjective outcome, percent highly sleep disturbed. So people get a 5 or 11-point scale, and they indicate how sleep disturbed they feel. And then those who choose the upper categories on that scale are considered highly sleep disturbed. And you can see that, both for aircraft, road, and rail traffic noise, that the percent highly sleep disturbed increases with noise exposure. It is considerably higher for aircraft noise. We don't fully understand why that is. There's a couple of theories. I don't have the time now to discuss this in detail. This is actually an update that we did, and that was recently accepted for publication. It's not out yet, but you can see that it looks like that the percent highly sleep disturbed relative to aircraft noise is even a little higher for the newly identified studies since we did this the last time. Interestingly enough, if you don't put the noise source into the question, these relationships completely vanish, which suggests that some of these responses actually not the rating of the sleep disturbance itself, but a rating of the attitude towards the noise source. Because otherwise, if you just ask for sleep disturbance, not mentioning aircraft noise, road or rail traffic noise, you would expect to see a similar relationship. But these relationships vanish. Next slide. We also did that for objective sleep disturbance, and here you can see that first reactions to the noise event seem to be starting between a maximum sound pressure level, which is the highest level of noise reached by a noise event, between 30 and 40 decibels, and then you see that quasi-linear increase in reaction probabilities with increasing noise levels. And interestingly, these look very similar. So while we have this difference in subjective responses, objectively, there's not a major difference between the different noise sources. And in the lab, actually, we showed that the reaction to aircraft noise is actually somewhat lower relative to rail and road traffic noise, and that may just be because aircraft noise the rise time is a little bit slower than if you're living right next to a rail track or a roadway. Next slide. And this information can be used then to see how is the population in the vicinity of an airport affected. This is a very old figure. This is Frankfurt Airport. Very old traffic data, but it shows these black lines with 1, 2, and 3. This is areas where we would expect 1, 2, or 3 additional awakenings induced by the aircraft noise. You can see that they're not perfectly overlapping with zones that are based on equivalent noise levels. In the US, it would be DNL, where the night gets a 10 dB malus. So the physiological reactions are not perfectly explained by just an average noise level, and so it may make sense to actually add additional components to assessing the effects of aircraft noise. And again, exposure response functions inform these zones, and they also inform in the end, or should inform, political decision making. Next slide, and I think that's my final one. So in conclusion, undisturbed sleep of sufficient duration is of paramount importance for health and well-being. And there are different scientific methods that can be used to investigate noise effects on sleep, all with their pros and cons. And as I mentioned, in the end, we kind of need all of them to paint the full picture. Traffic noise can disturb and fragment sleep, impair recuperation, and is likely a key contributor to long-term negative health consequences. And I didn't show what the evidence is for that, because I know that Thomas Münzel will do that in his talk. And we do need current and precise exposure response functions representative of the affected population to inform noise policy in general and limit values more specifically. Thank you for your attention. That's it.
Thank you, Matthias. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr.
Amy, just one question. Can you give me the moderator function when you're finished? This was the way to switch it to my...
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask Trish, Thomas, because my participants have all disappeared from my screen.
Mm-hmm.
It's the problems with Zoom that I'm experiencing. Trish, are you able to make Dr. Münzel co-host?
So are you talking to me?
No, I'm trying to make Professor Münzel a co-host, and I don't see that I can do that, Jamie.
Okay,
You have
so
tried that before.
I guess I'm going to have to run your slides.
Yeah, so that's busy.
It is busy. Okay, well, let's try it.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
It's not clear. Yeah.
You should have tried before, maybe. Mm.
Okay. Okay, let me share the screen. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation about noise and cardiovascular disease. I'm a cardiologist and also vascular biologist, so we can do the association between noise and disease. And as a vascular biologist, I also try to understand what is happening. So I'm from Mainz. You see here our nice dome. It's more than 1,000 years old, and maybe you know that Gutenberg is coming from Mainz, and he's actually responsible that we're able to read something. So he invented the printing. Next slide, please. I have no conflict of interest. Next slide, please. So we just recently summarized the environment and the risk factors and subsequent cardiovascular disease. And it was a comprehensive expert review published in Cardiovascular Research. The next slide, please. And you know, when we talk about the environment in cardiovascular disease, it's not just the noise contributing, of course, it's also air pollution. And we just learned also when you have noise, you have air pollution. When you have road noise, you have NO2 and PM 2.5. When you have aircraft noise, you have ultrafine particulate matter. We are fighting with the temperature a lot currently. We know that urban city planning is getting more and more important because 80% of the population is living in cities. And we also know, interestingly, which was also pretty new for me, that light pollution, outlight pollution is an important cardiovascular risk factor, also being responsible for ischemic cardiac death. The next slide, please. So I'm very happy, next slide, please, that let's say the journals are getting more interested in lifestyle journals in the topic of noise. And we had an article published in The Scientist, how environmental noise may harm the cardiovascular system. And they made beautiful illustration, which is also important to make the problem more popular. The next slide, please. And I want to talk to you now, how does noise damage the vasculature in the brain? The question is also, when we have repeated noise, do we get used to it, or maybe get a super sensitivity to vascular damage? What does it mean, noise annoyance, and does it has an impact on subsequent cardiovascular disease? And also, Matthias has mentioned it, nighttime noise and cardiovascular and cerebral damage, are they linked together? And what is the link between the annoyance reactions, mainly in the night, and subsequent cardiovascular disease? The next slide, please. So the WHO and European Environment Agency, you have seen also some of the numbers already from Matthias. So in western part of Europe, 1.6 million healthy life years are lost every year from traffic-related noise. Nearly 130 million Europeans in towns and cities are exposed to noise levels in excess of 55 decibels, which means at the level where health side effects have to be expected. The European Environment Agency is saying that we have 900,000 cases of hypertension, 40,000 hospital admissions, 6.5 million people suffer from high sleep disturbance, which is very important because sleep disturbance is now acknowledged as an important cardiovascular risk factor. And we have this high number of group with 22 million people suffer from chronic high annoyance. Next slide, please. Now, how is noise getting translated to cardiovascular disease? Next slide. And I'd like to introduce to you a paper published by Matthias Basner and Wolfgang Babisch from the Umweltbundesamt in the European Heart Journal, and Wolfgang Babisch always had the philosophy that we have two pathways of noise damage. The direct one, which means we have very high noise levels, more than 100 decibel, for example, it damaging the ear organ directly, or we have the indirect pathway, which means we have levels between 50 and 60 decibels, which reflects the communication. And this causes disturbance of activity, sleep, and communication, and we develop the annoyance reaction. So we are getting angry, which means these are reflecting cognitive and emotional responses. And this, of course, means we have stress, and we can measure that. So we see a sympathetic nerve activation. We can also measure sometimes an increase in cortisol levels. And if this is getting chronically, then you develop your own cardiovascular risk factors. So blood pressure goes up, lipids go up, and glucose levels go up. And if you have this for years, you get cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, stroke, heart failure, arrhythmia, arterial hypertension. Next slide, please. Okay. So the question was always, when we have this sequence of events, what at the end is causing cardiovascular disease? And this is actually the reason why we were starting some noise health side effects research. And I think it was in 2011 when a new, just one up, next slide. So yeah. So I just wanted to show that it was not clear why this noise stress at the end is getting translated into cardiovascular disease. And we know nowadays that aircraft noise may cause hypertension, coronary artery disease, heart failure, and stroke. Next slide. Just one example for. So what are you doing? Pressing the wrong button. Yeah, this is a publication from Martin Rösli. He's one of the leading noise researchers in Switzerland, and he showed, next slide please, that there is no, this was too far, one back please, that there is an association between transportation noise and myocardial infarction mortality, and this is independent from air pollution. It's always important if you adjust for air pollution, and very frequently we see that the association is getting less significant, which means it's a combination of both, of noise and air pollution, which is at the end may cause cardiovascular disease. But this is a process now ongoing for years. So over the years, you develop atherosclerosis, you get significant, let's say, calcification of the coronaries, and at the end you get coronary artery disease. But we also know from new data from Martin Rösli that aircraft noise, in particular nighttime aircraft noise, can trigger acute myocardial infarction. The next slide, please. That's a paper published from Apolline Saucy, European Heart Journal, and they actually established that exposure to noise levels higher than 55 decibel preceding death were significantly associated with mortality for all causes of cardiovascular disease. So when you have in the night, even Zurich Airport is not allowed to fly in the night. They have, of course, they have their exceptions, and then they realized when they have a flight in the night that 2 hours later, then this sudden cardiac event occurred, and they speculate that because of noise and an awakening reaction, stress reaction, you get an increase in stress hormone levels, you get an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, and this at the end may trigger acute cardiovascular death. Next slide, please. So we talked about the annoyance reactions, and you see here the decibel levels and the highly annoyed people in percent, and it's always for sure that aircraft noise is most annoying, followed by road noise and railway noise. Next slide, please. And we did some studies in the Gutenberg Health Study. It's like the Framingham study, what you have in Boston. In the US, we have the Gutenberg Health Study, where we included 15,000 people, and we checked for the effects of annoyance on arrhythmia and cerebral disease. Next slide. So you can see here, for example, that with increasing annoyance of the study participants, it's more likely that you get atrial fibrillation, which may stimulate secondary the development of stroke. Next slide, please. And this is a very important point, that noise is not just causing cardiovascular disease, it's very strong in causing mental disease. So here noise annoyance was associated with depression and anxiety, generalized anxiety. So when you have extreme annoyance development, the likelihood to get depression or generalized anxiety was at least twofold increased. The next slide, please. And even more disturbing, a study from Denmark, which studied road noise mainly, but also railway and aircraft noise. And they established, this was Mette Sørensen, she's one of the leading noise experts in Europe, that transportation noise was associated with higher risk of all-cause dementia and dementia subtypes, especially Alzheimer's disease and so on. This is something we have to focus on in future. What is the noise doing with our brain? Not just looking for the heart and the vascular system, also for the brain. Next slide, please. So the new paper, which was published in 2019 from Harvard, this was very exciting because it provided a neurobiological mechanism linking transportation noise to cardiovascular disease in humans. Next slide, please. And what they did actually, they were looking for the limbic system. The limbic system, where the amygdala nuclei are part of it, they modulate the fear and anxiety, but also the annoyance, anger reactions in humans. And they investigated 500 subjects, and they were performing a PET-CT with 18-fluorodeoxyglucose. And the interesting point is when you are exposed to high levels of noise, you actually see the amygdala lightening, which means you have some anxiety responses, and at the same time, just going down to the aorta, they've seen evidence of inflammation of the vasculature. So the link was, you have stress, you have amygdala, limbic system activation, and this is secondly causing inflammation of the vasculature. And inflammation of the blood vessels will lead at the end to major adverse cardiovascular events like myocardial infarction, stroke, and revascularization procedures. You don't see the amygdala lightening when you have low level of noise. You see no amygdala activation, and at the same time, you see no evidence for inflammation of the aorta. Next slide, please. Next slide. So here's not everything together. The link between noise level and amygdala activation, this is a quite close correlation. You see here cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And here again, we have this 55 decibel level. So when you have less than 55 decibel, which is supposed to be the threshold for cardiovascular side effects, we see no cardiovascular events. And if the level is higher than 55 decibel, you see evidence for cardiovascular events. On the right side, you see the pathophysiology, so transportation noise like road noise and aircraft noise activate the amygdala. This causes an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, inflammation, atherosclerosis, and then major adverse cardiovascular events such as myocardial infarction. Next slide, please. So then we said, of course, we want to understand why noise stress may cause cardiovascular damage. And so we started some studies in mice. Next slide, please. So what we did, we measured endothelial function, which is a measure for cardiovascular damage. And we simulated nighttime noise. We got a nice noise actually from Matthias Basner from the airport in Düsseldorf. We exposed healthy medical students to nighttime aircraft noise, and this was a field study, so it was performed in the house of the students. The maximum was 60 decibel, 30 or 60 flights per night. The mean sound pressure levels were 43 and 46 decibel, and we measured vascular function before and after noise exposure. The next slide, please. And then it's interesting to see that just one night in a healthy subject, 39 noise events in one night also causes vascular damage. So see a reduction in endothelial function, and this was slightly more pronounced when you had 60 noise events. Surprisingly, we could improve it by giving acutely vitamin C, which means that oxidative stress, oxygen-derived free radicals are important for the damage. And we also observed a so-called priming effect, which means we had a randomization plan. So for example, we did no noise events, which is called here control, and we had 30 and 60 noise events. And then we were randomizing to other sequences with like 60 control, 30, 60, 30 control. So an interesting point was always when 30 was in front of 60. So when the guy had already experience with a noise event, then the deterioration of vascular function was substantially more pronounced. So there is no tolerance development to noise effects. It's rather a sensitization to vascular damage, which we've observed. And we have also seen an increase in stress hormone levels. Next slide, please. Then we wanted to know the pathophysiology, so we developed a nice animal model. Next slide, please. You can read this nicely in Nature Review Cardiology if you want to know everything in detail. The next slide, please. So we exposed mice 1, 2, and 4 days to noise, and we have seen that they have hypertension, blood pressure goes up, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and we have seen an increase in stress hormone levels, adrenaline, dopamine, angiotensin 2, and adrenaline were actually increased. The next slide, please. And we've seen that what we have seen also in humans, that we get vascular dysfunction. So when we check the aorta of these animals, so we take out the vessels and check it in special, let's say, organ chambers, and check the function of the endothelium, we see a shift to the right, which means we see here endothelial dysfunction. And the interesting point is just one night of aircraft noise causes the same vascular damage like having 4 weeks of arterial hypertension of feeding animals for 8 weeks with a high cholesterol diet. So this stress has an incredible adverse negative effect on our cardiovascular system. You see the production of nitric oxide is going down. Next slide, please. And we see that oxidative stress and endothelin, which is the strongest vasoconstrictor in our body, is getting strikingly increased. So these are all very bad signs and very bad events which happen very early in the sequence after aircraft noise exposure. Next slide, please. So the pathophysiology is more complex now, but we know for sure that aircraft noise stimulates, activates the brain. The amygdala is very important. We get signs for inflammation in the vasculature. We also know that, next slide, please, that the inflammatory, no, back, please, that the inflammatory cells are getting activated. And we see that vascular function is completely disturbed, which is actually mainly responsible for that the process of calcification of the vessel is getting initiated. Next slide, please. So, and then we check the sleep duration. We know it predicts cardiovascular outcomes. So the question is, when we have, let's say, aircraft noise in the night, what happens to our animals? The next slide, please. Jamie, next slide, please. You are hiding.
I apologize, I'm here. I'm just trying to get to the correct slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, let's see.
It's bad that we couldn't share it correctly. So that's.
Yeah, and that it's just getting stuck.
Oh.
Okay, we're almost there. Okay, so
That's Matthias. It's a wrong presentation.
Sorry about that.
No, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
It's still stuck.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Perhaps if you don't go in presentation mode, just leave it,
That's right.
then it may not get stuck.
Yeah.
Comes a little late for me, but
Maybe the aircraft owners or the airport owners are having some interference.
Is this it?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay.
Just keep it that way and
Yeah.
start. So of course, we just said that sleep disturbance is a risk factor. So we're very interested whether nighttime aircraft noise is more damaging than daytime noise. Just the next slide.
Doesn't seem to help either. All right, we'll just do this.
Presentation modus. Yeah. So this was a very interesting observation when we exposed our animals to noise during the sleep phase. We have seen all the side effects. The vasculature was damaged. We get endothelial dysfunction and we get oxidative stress and all the side effects, more endothelial expression. But when we exposed our animals during the day to aircraft noise, nothing happens. So the nighttime noise is the very decisive one. Next slide. Here you see the same, just nighttime noise, for example, increases the production of this oxygen-derived free radicals, makes oxidative stress, and we see it also in human plasma. Nitrotyrosine and isoprostanes, which are markers for oxidative stress, are strikingly increased in the response to nighttime noise. The next slide. It was very disturbing to me, the adverse effects on the brain. So when we have 4 nights of nighttime noise, just four nights aircraft noise, then we see that in the brain, a very important enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, is getting downregulated. And this enzyme is responsible for cognitive function, memory, and learning. So, and this explains by, maybe you have seen this data from the ranch study, that children who respond with increased annoyance have also a decline in cognitive function. So this is very disturbing that we see this very profound changes in the brain already after 4 days of and 4 nights of continuous noise. Next slide. So here again, the side effects of nighttime noise, we see that we have more stiffer vessels. That's also interesting that because of the stress, the vascular stiffness is increased. And we also see that the blood pressure in the night is higher as compared to people being exposed to aircraft noise during the day. The next slide, please. So in summary, I think there's no doubt anymore that noise causes cardiovascular and cerebral damage. Noise increases blood pressure and increases stress hormone release. Repeated noise events prime the vasculature for developing vascular damage. We don't see tolerance to damage development, so we see rather the opposite, that the vessels are getting more sensitive to damage. And cardiovascular damage, we just see it in response to nighttime noise. So the night has to be protected, and aircraft noise should be completely forbidden in the night, and aircrafts shouldn't start in the night. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And I'm so sorry about the technical problems, but we'll just have to live with that. And I didn't really introduce Dr. Munzel properly, but I think you can see from his research that he and his colleagues are really leading globally this effort to elucidate the mechanisms by which noise causes systemic disease. So lastly, I'm going to introduce Peter Bingham. Dr. Bingham is the Chief of Pediatric Neurology at University of Vermont Medical Center in Burlington. and his concern over the neurological and cardiovascular impacts of military aviation noise on children prompted him to write an impassioned letter to Vermont's governor and senators to address the problem. And Peter, I think I'm going to have to bring up your draft presentation. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you for doing that. Glad to
Okay, so maybe you can make an introduction while I go in and do that.
Sure, thank you. So as a pediatric neurologist up in Burlington and formerly in Philadelphia, I am asked to do what I think is often expected in a medical visit, is draw things down to one cause. And I think this is a medical model that many of you are familiar with. And I am glad to kind of come into this more complex systems world of public health, where things don't have just one answer. And one of the books that sort of caught my attention recently, I have a slide for, is The Gardener and the Carpenter. The idea that our responsibility for protecting and taking care of children is a lot more like the role of a gardener, I would say, and go ahead a slide, than the carpenter, and that we really have to think of lots of different influences on children's health. There's not one thing. And next slide, thank you. So as has been mentioned, there are many people and children under these flight paths, and that there's abundant evidence from both animal models and, as has been discussed, epidemiological evidence about impact on children's behavior, cognition, mood, and self-control, self-regulation. So when I talk to people around Burlington and Winooski, because we have F-35s flying, making deafening sounds recorded at 110 decibels on the sidewalk, where, you know, I think you cannot think with that kind of sound going on. Well, I hear, well, it's temporary and you can get used to it. I'm sure many of you have heard of a similar response. And yet the evidence we have, and it has been presented today, is this is a neurotoxin. Next slide. That's right. I think that we need to introduce a terminology here to drive the point home, that sound of a certain quality, not all noise. I think we're qualifying noise, and we're still learning to do that in different ways beyond just decibels, but that we're talking about a neurotoxin. And one of the things about bringing this in is how different neurotoxins have been discussed in the past. And lead has been mentioned in the chat. Thank you. Next slide. When I was a child in Westchester, New York, we were just beginning to realize, my goodness, this is a neurotoxin in our homes. And there was a whole discussion and a kind of a back and forth with industry, which may have tended in a not good way to contradict this and say, oh, lead, it's good for children. And so this is about kind of coming to attention and making a comparison here. They're very different kinds of neurotoxins, of course, noise, loud noise, and lead. But it's I think it's a parallel kind of a discussion. Thank you, next slide. There's an idea that there's really no okay level of lead, and we're coming around to the idea that they're above a certain level and low frequency vibration level and decibels of noise, that there may really be no okay level of noise either. And this started with Arlene Bronzap's work going over 40 years ago. Thank you, Arlene. And some of the marvel of her research is a before and after effect. Next slide, looking at children's reading skills. And next slide, that had a lot to do with other kinds of transportation noise than what we're talking about today. But there's a common ground, a common denominator here when we're thinking about neurodevelopment of children. Next slide. There's some wonderful neuroepidemiological evidence that has been alluded to, and a lot by a wonderful researcher that I want to mention, Dr. Stephen Stansfeld in England. Next slide. So there are three things that I want to kind of bring home here in terms of what is the neurologist's way to frame, say, an education conducted with families, with children, with adolescents. The three kind of models of the effects that have been discussed so far. And one is, it's not concussion, but it's very closely related to concussion in all of the different neuropsychological ways that noise effects have been measured. They overlap in many ways with what happens with concussion. Next slide. And then we've talked a little bit about the sympathetic fight or flight response, not literally represented here in representations of EEG, of brain waves. Studies showing that different doses, different levels in decibels of noise alter the brain waves in a way that is undoubtedly aligned with, say, amygdala activation, as Thomas mentioned, and a fight or flight response. This is about learning hormones and trauma. There's a lot of discussion about PTSD and as a unfortunate learning sequence. And so one aspect of the effect on cognition, attention, mood regulation has to do with a terrible learning effect that noise has, loud noise, on our brains and our behavior. Next slide. And the third thing that I want to bring up is just the most basic nutrient in the garden that we have, that we would tend in supporting children's neurodevelopment, and that is attachment, bonding. Not to mention the situation where the parent may have experience, as many new Americans, immigrants in the Burlington area do have, coming to us for refuge from combat areas and the associations that they have with military aircraft flying overhead. What effect does that have on a repeated basis on parent-child, parent-infant bonding? Something that we could only imagine just beginning to discover and to measure. Next slide. And Dr. Munsell also mentioned something that is relatively remote in our thinking from immediate effects on childhood neurodevelopment, but long-term effects on neurodegenerative condition, emerging animal models and wonderful and terrifying neuroepidemiological evidence that we often turn to countries in Europe and especially Scandinavia, a study referenced below that covers millions of people, which is compelling. Next slide. So when I think about this and how to begin to talk about it and all the information that we've had that should have awoken us, I think of somebody kind of whistling in the dark. You have this nice saying from Gandhi about that you judge a society by how it takes care of its most vulnerable members. And how can we begin to ask questions and communicate about this using new words that can draw attention to this problem? Next slide. I'm not going to go over all of these points in details, but it just thinking of this conference led me to consider, where is the signal to noise problem in this discussion as we work to collaborate ideally with military authorities, commercial, aviation, other transportation industries about this as a public health problem. Well, part of it has been alluded to, and it's interesting that premature birth, as was mentioned, occurs under flight paths, maybe at a higher rate, and then premature people who are born prematurely may have a special vulnerability to noise effects, a compounding effect. How do we measure noise? And what outcomes do we use to really detect the effect so that we can be most responsive to it? And then this minimization, this idea, there's a little excitement. Maybe we sometimes like noise. The word noise is in a way a problem in itself because it covers such a variety of things and how to characterize noise that is in fact a neurotoxin. We know that inferences about causality can always be challenged from epidemiological research, like what are the confounders and how can we correspond with the media? Next slide. one aspect of the confounders has been alluded to, which is there are different levels of exposure according to socioeconomic, demographic kinds of factors. And I'm not saying in this slide showing that there is a different vocabulary growth depending on these indices of socioeconomic conditions. That's not all due to noise, but I do believe that some of these gaps here are related to noise in addition to other environmental factors, health access, nutrition, etc. Next slide. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I would welcome any other discussion as I think of how in a collaborative way can we approach. I appreciate that Ms. Holmes Norton is on this and hearing, and a legislator, a wonderful, and people concerned with policy making. Like, how can we enlarge and cultivate this discussion and get on the same page? Thank you. Next slide. Thanks to these organizations and people who have supported the whole work and consciousness and discussion that we're having, and have helped me to awaken this and how to bring this discussion into the exam room. Thanks. I can't hear you. You're muted, Jamie.
Yeah, Peter, thank you for that presentation, and thank you so much to the panel. I'm afraid we're running late. I'm sure people want to take a quick break. We're going to switch gears now. If you want to grab something to eat, use the bathroom, please go ahead. But I think we're just going to jump into our community panel. I am going to hand over the microphone to our moderator, Nina Berman, who is a professor of journalism at Columbia Journalism School and will be guiding the panel through this. And Nina, I'll have some slides, which hopefully I can get through for the presenters.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. I came to this panel as a result of research into the effect of military aircraft training on civilian populations in Burlington, Vermont, with the F-35s, and in the Northwest Puget Sound area with the Navy Growler planes. But as you all know, military impacts are just one small piece of the bigger picture, which is a national skyscape that has become a threat to human health. In the next 30 minutes, we will hear stories from residents and communities all across the US who are living amid harmful environments as a result of aviation noise and pollution. Our panel is representative of millions of people who feel trapped, besieged, terrorized, sacrificed, and fundamentally unheard and uncared for. People in the neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status and majority Black and brown residents bear the heaviest burden. This is a national health crisis too often reframed as a nuisance, where the onus of mitigation is placed on the victims themselves. This is not a solution. Our regulations are supposed to protect us, but they clearly are not. And the science around noise pollution increasingly points to not just auditory impacts, but severe cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, along with cognitive impairment, as we have just heard. To create safer and healthier communities, those experiencing these impacts need to be fully seen and heard, hence our panel. While their talks will be short due to time constraints, realize that these testimonies speak to years of grief, frustration, and pain, and in some cases, people having to flee their homes in search of quiet. We'll hear from those who feel as though their own military treats them as the enemy. We'll hear from those whose lives have been upended so that pleasure seekers can use the airspace like personal playgrounds. We will hear from those in big cities whose backyards feel like an extension of airport runways. Each story is unique, yet there are clear commonalities, which is why solutions must involve all stakeholders. Thank you for listening closely and compassionately to these stories. We will start off first with Melissa Elstein from Stop the Chop in the New York, New Jersey area. Melissa, are you with us?
Hello, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jamie. And just the highlight of the low light of working on this community issue is meeting wonderful people like you who care about the planet, who care about people's health. So I'm with Stop the Chop NYNJ, and we're a nonprofit, all volunteer run organization. I'm personally based in New York City, but we have members throughout the New York metropolitan area, including New Jersey, including Long Island, the Hamptons, and Westchester. Today, we actually were at a press conference at City Hall. We have good news to report. We had introduction of a new bill that would ban non-essential helicopters, which is what we're being plagued with. Non-essential is defined as the sightseeing, tourist, commuter, and charter. And this new legislation that was introduced by council members, Ressler and Gail Brewer, among others, would ban those helicopters from the New York City owned heliports. This is huge. We also have congressional legislation that's been introduced over the last 3 years, HR 1643, 389, 7769. And we thank our Congress members Nadler, Maloney, Velasquez in New York, and others for introduction of that. Of course, we want to see that passed. I'll put my website in the chat, and you can look at all that legislation. There's also state bills that have been introduced and have passed, but are waiting for Governor Hochul's signature. And again, that's on our website. So quickly, I only have 3 minutes, and Jamie, please let me know when I'm nearing my end of my presentation. The situation in New York City and that goes towards New Jersey and Long Island, the Hamptons, is that we have 2 primary causes of helicopter noise and pollution. The commuter charters, and they leave from all 3 heliports on Manhattan. And these heliports, by the way, are all south of 40th Street. And if you know Manhattan, it's a very narrow island. So that alone is quite absurd. We also have the problem of sightseeing tourist helicopters. We have 30,000 that are allowed currently from the downtown heliport near the seaport. 30,000 annually. They go up and down the harbor, the Hudson River, and around the harbor. And we also have sightseeing helicopters that are from Kearney, New Jersey, Linden, New Jersey, and some from Westchester. Those are not limited in where they can go. So they go over Central Park, the Brooklyn Bridge, Empire State Building often, World Trade Center. You know, all of our historic landmarks are now at jeopardy from these low-flying helicopters. The irony of being in the New York City area is the helicopters are mandated to fly below 2,000 feet so they don't interfere with all of our international and national traffic from the 3 major airports. So we're dealing with sightseeing and commuters. Now, I did email our supporters for their experiences as per the request of this specific panel. And I have 20 pages of responses, and I only have 3 minutes. So I wanted to just read some of the highlights, just words, because the point of this is to show how community residents are being affected. I could speak from my personal experience, which is why I'm spending most of my time when I'm not teaching yoga and ballet on this issue. But I'd rather have my community members and our supporters, their words be represented than mine. So I have someone responded by saying, New York City is invaded by helicopters. This is an assault by noise and pollution. It's not livable. It's extremely stressful. The vibrations and the noise causes a visceral queasiness. These helicopters emit a low subsonic frequency that nothing can block. It makes the buildings vibrate. They're bludgeoning us. It's an overbearing racket. Constant noise all day, rumbling and drone every 3 to 5 minutes, causing stress and anxiety, a direct assault, all day long assault. You start noticing the words, and it is an attack. We all feel like we're under attack. And the thing about helicopters, and I'm digressing for a moment, is that originally they were created not for sightseeing tours. And by the way, we have the doors off in New York City. We have the outrageous helicopters that fly from New Jersey, no doors at all, feet dangle, so that people, tourists, can take what's called shoe selfies. And we had a 2018 crash of that. This company is called Fly Nyan. They were losing power over Central Park and crashed in the East River. 5 tourists drowned because they were strapped in because there are no doors. That this is allowed to fly over the most populous city in the country is outrageous. So you're seeing and hearing that, you know, this extreme noise and vibrations are creating a sensation of an attack. And helicopters were created for the military, for emergency. For those of us who lived through 9/11, and I where I'm sitting right now, my apartment, I did live through 9/11, and it does trigger PTSD, especially because of the nature of these vehicles. And they were never supposed to be designed for sightseeing over residential neighborhoods. So we'll continue reading from some of these comments. We're discouraged from being able to use our parks. This is a big comment that I hear over and over, and I personally experience it as well. Constant disruption of what should be peaceful and restorative recreational activities in our parks. We are under siege. Here's another one, assault.
So Melissa, I'm going to
Yes.
have to ask you to wrap up because we
Yes.
have so many presentations.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted you to let me know when it was 3 minutes. And I can wrap up because it is starting to get repetitive. But one last comment, in one of the letters that somebody mailed me, they spelled heliport as hell, H-E-L-L-I, port. And that is perfect because New York City and the surrounding area has become a helicopter hell. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll put my website, and if you want my contact information, follow us on social media and sign our petition, please. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Melissa. That was fantastic. Up next is Kim Gibbs.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Gibbs. Don't know if you can show the graphics that we had provided. So in 2011, I founded Citizens for Quiet Skies in Boulder County, Colorado, to address concerns about excessive noise from a skydiving operation company. The skydiving fleet of twin turboprop aircraft would fly repeated loops at full power to reach jump altitude, blanketing our community with abusive, low-frequency noise for 12 plus hours a day. After exhausting all other options, in 2014, we sued Mile High Skydiving and lost. The court awarded judgments against us, the plaintiffs, exceeding $120,000. The Colorado court sent a clear message that there would be no legal remedy for Citizens. Today, unrestrained airport expansion and flight training have further increased the noise burden in the community. Over the years, I have met with citizens across the U.S. who describe their experience with repetitive and noisy flights from general aviation airports. They include flight training, skydiving, sightseeing, glider towing, flight clubs, air taxis, helicopters, cargo operations, charter jets, and large military aircraft. They describe sacrifice zones where repetitive flights are exported to neighborhoods many miles away from the airport where citizens have no representation. Many advocates, including myself, have been subjected to intense targeted aviation harassment. And finally, they report similar health effects: intense frustration, feeling powerless, anger, rage, intense anxiety, and tension within the home environment. So today, I continue to advocate for quiet skies because I truly value environmental quality. It is foundational to the well-being of communities. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kim. Next, Jamie, will you be reading for Tracy? Or?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
So Tracy Williams is here with us, but she has an unstable internet connection. So she has asked me to read her statement. My name is Tracy Williams. Aircraft noise has negatively changed life for me and my family. We live in a rural, underserved community in eastern central Alabama with a population between 900 and 1,000 people, mainly people of color. Our community and adjoining ones are subjected to constant noise from different types of aircraft from different airports. We constantly hear various small engine planes, including those from a flight school conducting various training exercises day and night, and from commercial and private jets, cargo planes, military aircraft, helicopters, and more, all flying over and near our area. We're exposed to at least 100 to 150 flights per day, averaging more than 1,000 per week, 6 a.m. to midnight from different types of aircraft, midnight to 6 a.m. from commercial jets and helicopters. The aircraft noise is loud, constant, and repetitive, penetrating through our walls and windows. There's a roaring and rumbling, whirling and high-pitched whining, vibrating and droning, all varying in extremity. My husband and I have experienced chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and sleep interruptions. My health has been seriously affected. I have high blood pressure, panic attacks, ear ringing, and respiratory and breathing difficulties. The repetitive noise has affected our child's learning at home, causing her to exert greater energy to read, focus, and concentrate. She becomes more stressed and more irritable. The intrusions are frequent and have left us feeling hopeless, helpless, unable to enjoy our home and property, and fearful of further harassment and retaliation in response to our efforts to raise awareness and seek help. Despite our 6 years of flight recordings, numerous letters and phone calls to federal representatives, airports, regional FAA offices, and others, our calls for help have gone unheeded. Instead, to my horror, authorities have redirected more flights over our communities as we stand powerless, daring to seek accountability and resolution. Thank you, and thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. That was a very powerful statement. Next, we're going to hear from Chris Hurley.
Hi, I'm Chris Hurley, and I'm a founding member and a volunteer with the Sound Defense Alliance on Whidbey Island in Northwest Washington, north of Seattle. The Naval Air Station Whidbey Island is home of the Growler jets, which block communication using electronic weaponry. The Navy uses Whidbey for takeoff and landing training and conducts warfare practice over the Olympic National Park. Ironically, the home of the quietest place in the US, continental US. Approximately 60,000 people live in the 60,000 people in the greater Puget Sound area are affected by the noise. In central Whidbey, where the Navy uses a small World War II runway, noise has been measured in excess of 120 decibels under the flight path. This map shows the region where we live and the noise zone of the Growlers. On Whidbey, the Growlers conduct 30,000 touch and go operations each year in low altitude flight paths, flying over homes, schools, and hospitals. Growlers also fly 2,300 operations over the Olympic National Park. The impact on humans and wildlife is significant and negative, but the Navy thunders on and wants to expand its presence, bring more jets and more flights. Here are some recent quotes from our community complaint line that covers our entire noise region. So here we go. This is government authorized domestic terrorism. The noise is reverberating through my house and my body like being at a rock concert. I put my rangefinder on one of them. They're flying at 450 feet directly above my house. My 6-month-old can't take naps. This is my worst experience in a campground ever. From morning to night, the jets have been relentless. 8 hours of near constant screaming, roaring, blasting, and shaking. That amount of noise in a residential area is pure torture. And lastly, my grandchildren burst into tears. And Shelley will talk about being on the other end of the noise zone in Puget Sound.
I'll go ahead. I'm Shelley Kincaid. I'm a 40-year veteran in education as a teacher and as an administrator. I live on the edge of Olympic National Park in Forks. Olympic National Park has been designated officially as a quiet park, No longer. With the 2016 onset of growler flights over our town and Olympic National Park, I joined numerous state and national organizations to advocate for quiet skies. Flights over our part of the region start mid-morning because it takes the flights from Whidbey to get over to us and continue past 11 o'clock at night. The inescapable noise of the growlers, especially in our area when they are firing their afterburners as part of their electronic warfare exercises, can be heard and felt over the crashing waves at the beach and above forestry operations. Hearing nature and experiencing peaceful tranquility have become exceedingly rare. Teachers report greater agitation in the classroom when growlers fly and the frustration of having to stop instruction for the jets to pass. More than one child has asked recently if we are at war with Russia, as is Ukraine. Children on the playground cannot hear their supervisors. Parents are reporting their children exhibit greater irritability at home and increased flares of temper tantruming. Young children on the autism spectrum or with past trauma and mental health issues have run to hide to try to escape the sound, rumble, and vibrations they feel in their little bodies. Residents report heightened stress, higher blood pressure, rage, resentment, powerless frustration, alienation, and withdrawal. Concern over the growler jet noise has also torn apart our small community. Tourists expecting a quiet national park experience complain at motels and at the visitor center. Local citizens who speak up on behalf of quiet skies are targeted by those supporting the sounds of freedom, dividing our very small community, causing more stress and pressure on friendships and social gatherings. Hear us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. And also, thank you, Chris. Now we're going to hear more about commercial aircraft, starting with Ann Hollander.
My name is Ann Hollander. I am a founder and leader of the Montgomery County Quiet Skies Coalition of Maryland. Montgomery County borders the District of Columbia and experienced negligible noise from airplane traffic until 7 years ago. In 2015, the FAA, without warning, moved the flight paths for all commercial aircraft arriving and departing Washington Reagan National Airport to new paths that take them directly over approximately 7,500 homes, 20,000 residents, and numerous K-12 schools in our county. It then concentrated those flights into narrow rails. Our communities are now subjected to noise from over 400 low-altitude commercial aircraft every day, over 146,000 commercial aircraft per year. I recently asked members of our community to send me a single adjective that best describes how it feels to live with this constant aircraft noise. Residents describe feeling anxious, agitated, angry, assaulted, bombarded, frustrated, worried, irritable, distracted, and stressed. The fact that they had no say whatsoever in this intrusion makes them feel unjustly harassed, oppressed, undervalued, exploited, enraged, and powerless. Several described it as criminal. The noise begins at 5:30 a.m. every day and extends well past midnight every night, leaving people sleep deprived, fatigued, uncentered, depressed, and exhausted. One person mentioned being afraid that she would be fired from her job because she is so sleep deprived. Another reported that he saved for 30 years to buy a house in his community, but now cannot sleep in his own bed. The fact that there is no way to escape or avoid the noise leaves people feeling defeated, deprived, helpless, and trapped. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Next up is Maria Becci. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
You did it perfectly, Nina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Becci, and I have lived for over 40 years in a century-old community between LaGuardia and JFK airports in Queens, New York. Before 2012, we were accustomed to commercial aircraft flying at higher altitudes above our community. Suddenly, the FAA changed flight procedures at LaGuardia to deconflict airspace between the two airports, promising no noise impact to residential communities. In fact, Queens residents were blasted out of bed at 6 a.m. The noise was so intense that my initial thought was another terrorist attack in New York City. The flight procedure changes resulted in the complete destruction of everyday life with low altitude flights several minutes apart for up to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. These changes were so terrible and intolerable that Governor Andrew Cuomo created the New York Community Aviation Roundtable. For me, my family, and my community, this has caused enormous stress and countless hours filing noise complaints, educating ourselves about airport operations, community meetings with elected officials, and a feeling of helplessness beyond our control. I refuse to sleep at night while filing noise complaints late into the early morning hours, only to have several hours of quiet before the plane started again. The soundscape of our historic community changed overnight from that of birdsong to the repeated sound of distant thunder building to a crescendo of screaming jet engines over our home. I have been working ever since to regain our quality of life. Some comments from my community describing anger, despondency, cognitive malfunction, and fear. The low flying and constant repetition of aircraft is an all-out assault on one's senses. We are unable to enjoy a spring evening in the yard. The planes are constantly waking up our newborn, who in turn wakes up our older child, and then nobody gets any sleep. I couldn't think or concentrate. Impossible to decorate the holidays, losing the ability to untangle holiday lights, listening to one screaming plane after the next. I am desperate to take a nap after chemotherapy. I should be able to rest in my own home. We never know when the planes will start. It's really awful living in fear. How can they just take away our peaceful life? A minor disagreement easily escalates to a screaming match. The abusive noise is so terrible. Many have no memory of quietness. Thank you, quiet communities. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Maria. We all hear you. Next up is Barbara Brown.
Yes, I'm Barbara Brown, chairperson of the Eastern Queens Alliance and also the JFK Airport Committee. The communities in Southeast Queens, north of JFK Airport, are bombarded by jet noise day and night from takeoffs and landings. The noise is unrelenting. Low-flying planes crisscross our neighborhoods, roaring overhead every minute. There is always a low rumble or din heard from idling planes on the airport. This is not only a quality of life issue, but a health issue and an environmental justice issue as well for our majority Black community. In addition to the noise, we are equally concerned about aviation-related air pollution, We believe that comprehensive independent studies of noise, air pollution, and possible related health effects within 5 to 10 miles from JFK Airport need to be conducted. Some data to note: average decibel levels in our communities hover around 70, and with the added penalty for night flights, around 75. Some decibels are actually experienced in the 80s, particularly from departures. An example, an average decibel for the sampled area on April 22nd was 72, and that was an average for the whole day. People who experience over 55 decibels of aircraft noise are complaining. The number of flights over 55 decibels could be well over 300 in a day. In the current New York State Disadvantaged Communities Map of Environmental Burdens for the CLCPA, airports are not included as a burden, interestingly. What we do see from these maps is that in Southeast Queens, the asthma rate is around the 80th percentile in census tracts. Low birth weight is at the 93rd percentile and above. Premature deaths in the 70 to 80 percentile range. All of these could be indicators of noise and or air pollution impacts, but studies must be done that result in mitigation, and they must look at mitigation recommendations. Air pollution levels reported in that same study, and we don't know the source of the monitors, but they're reporting benzene at 58th percentile in Southeast Queens, particulate matter PM 2.5 at 53 percentile, diesel trucks about the 82nd percentile, and JFK Airport is a major air cargo center. Our question is, to what degree are any of these indicators, to what degree are these environmental burdens related to proximity to JFK? And we are demanding studies be done and with the purpose of finding effective mitigation strategies. And thank you to Quiet Communities.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for your excellent presentation. Next up is Elaine Miller.
Is Elaine muted?
Elaine, are you here?
I am. I'm so sorry. I started and I didn't unmute. I'll begin again. Thank you. I'm Elaine Miller, co-founder of Plain Sense for Long Island. We work with communities outside the 65 DNL in Nassau County that have been undergoing devastating effects from next-gen flight paths, some of which allow jets to fly at dangerously low altitudes over our homes. I will read 3 stories from members of our organization. As you will hear, the peace, sanctity of our homes and the health of our children and families are at stake. Stacy Vargas, 10 miles from JFK. Me, my husband, children, and dog are being impacted physically, emotionally, and psychologically from round-the-clock plane landings. Noise, fuel smells, and filthy air surround our home. The house shudders when a plane is at 1,900 feet. The dog shakes. My husband tries to tune out, but the constant noise sets him on edge. My children are anxious when the 22L runway goes live at night. Without effective noise mitigation, nobody sleeps, diminishing our children's school performance. I fear for our lives and the ability to live free from harmful noise and pollution. Anne Marie Cerrone, 20 miles from JFK. 3 years ago, I purchased my dream home. My backyard was going to be my sanctuary, but now I feel on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I work from home and can't concentrate with the constant roar of planes every 30 seconds at 1,500 feet. I can't sit in my backyard. I smell jet fuel. I worry about the carcinogens my children are breathing. I am distraught that my home is now worthless. I have a constant headache because there is no reprieve for days on end. Sometimes 3 planes fly at once over our house, causing me to shut the windows and crawl into bed, depressed and searching for a new home where I could hear the birds. Patricia Ziegler, 5 miles from JFK. Since NextGen, my family has been tortured by low-flying planes every 60 to 90 seconds directly over our house. Previously, planes flew higher and flights were dispersed, no problem. Now our homes are nearly unlivable. Nothing drowns out the noise, even the heaviest duty earplugs. We are awakened at 1 a.m., hearts racing by low-flying cargo planes and whining Airbuses. It's like living in a war zone, to say nothing of the exhaust pollution, which is slowly poisoning us. Thank you, everyone, and thank you listening to our members of our community.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Next up, we're going to hear from Matt Santoro.
Hello, I am Matt Santoro. I'm a high school student. I live in Bayside, New York, which is about 10 miles away from LaGuardia Airport. Planes depart from LaGuardia often. A lot of the time, they actually depart at the worst times possible. This affects me in a number of ways. When I'm about to fall asleep, if I hear a plane flying over, with roaring engines, I feel angry because I know I won't be able to fall asleep for the next half hour, which I believe affects my sleep rhythm. I also believe this can affect me in school the next day. When I come home and I'm working on my personal computer projects and I'm brainstorming issues, the planes flying above cause me to lose my thoughts, and this ruins the progress of the projects I'm working on. This makes me feel very upset and angry. The overhead plane noises cause me to feel very upset and get angry too many times.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm going to just quickly sort of summarize some of the things that I think we're all hearing. I'm sure these stories are familiar to many in the audience. Some commonalities is that people are feeling powerless, that their elected officials do not care, or do not listen, or are offering them no solutions. Certain industries are prioritized over others, that our places for peace, leisure, and restoration, our parks and our forests have been compromised. We feel we are under attack as though we are living in a constant war zone. And perhaps in some ways, maybe the worst of all this is that activists who are doing heroic work here are often targeted, harassed, called awful names, stalked, and are seen as the problem. And of course, people are getting sick. They're afraid they will be sick. They're afraid for their children and their homes, which for many are their life investments, have become worthless. I want to thank everyone for sharing these stories. I know that every single presenter could speak for at least an hour on all they've experienced and all they've witnessed. I also want to thank the activists who truly are doing heroic work here. And now I would like to pass along to our next panel, which is on public health impact and legal strategies.
And Jamie, I'm happy to take over if that's what you'd like. You tell me.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. And yeah, Todd, let's, I just want to say we're unfortunately running a bit late. So I think we're going to just work our way right through the program and see where we are and see if we'll have time for questions at the end. So Todd, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Jamie. Todd Wildermuth, direct the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Washington, and have participated with Quiet Communities in a petition to the EPA to revitalize the Noise Control Act. I am here to very quickly introduce and get going and get out of the way of our legal panel. It consists of, as you see here, and their full bios are available. I'll just give you the shortest versions. Elizabeth Geltman. Elizabeth Geltman has academic appointments at both the CUNY School of Public Health and John Hopkins lecturing in environmental science and policy, 17 books, most of those in law, and is trained as an attorney in addition to the many things I've already said. Barbara Lichtman is with us. She also crosses many disciplines, has a PhD and a JD. She's a registered federal lobbyist and has extensive litigation, especially in the area of air transportation issues. And last but not least, we have Stephen Tabor, who also has extensive litigation experience across many environmental laws. He's been focusing many of the past years in aviation. He leads his firm's aviation and aerospace industry group. So lots of experience here. When we had a planning meeting, it was a super hot panel of people with a ton of thoughts. And so I'm going to just turn it over to them as quickly as possible. Before I do that, just want to say, appreciate all of the testimonies we have just heard. We understand these are real issues. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview to say that we have probably like sort of a bad news, good news portion to our order, but just hang on because it'll be there. And so I'm going to go in the
Todd,
order.
I'm
Yes,
sorry to interrupt. I just do want to mention, as Trish raised at the beginning, we will be having a solutions conference in October. And the idea behind having our legal panel is to start to give some ideas of paths we can pursue. You know, what may not make sense to spend a lot of time on and other things that may very well be worth our efforts. So we look forward to seeing people in October as well.
All right, excellent plug. Yes, that's what we're doing. We're setting you up for the next round. Thank you, Jamie. So we'll go in the order of Stephen, Barbara, and Elizabeth, and I'll just read my first question, and I hope Stephen's with us and ready to roll. Stephen, all of you have experience with federal rulemaking or advancing federal legislation. Our planning conversation leads me to think that you three do not see these things as promising in the short term for reducing aviation noise, but I'm sure our audience would like to learn more. Should people hoping to protect the public from aviation noise be looking for help in the form of federal legislation or petitions for federal rulemaking?
Yes, to address the legislation and regulations, it's looking for help in those areas is probably more beneficial than litigation, but still the fact of the matter is that it's still going to be a hard push to get regulations that altered to support to provide the regulations that are needed for communities to get the support that they need from Congress. Regulations means that you're focusing on the federal agency, in that case, the FAA. The FAA has shown no willingness to address aircraft noise and emissions as a public health issue, and still see it as a form of annoyance rather than as public health. Congress has been a little bit more willing to listen to communities. However, their focus seems to be more on community involvement after the FAA has already made a decision. With the reauthorization coming up in 2023, as Congresswoman the Congresswoman mentioned earlier in this presentation, that is going to be I would say the focus of any efforts that the community should do. In any kind of standalone act or legislation is probably not going to be looked on with any favor by Congress.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Appreciate it. Stephen's trying to move us ahead on time. We will turn now to Barbara.
Hopefully you can hear me, and I thank you very much. And I will launch right into my seminal discussion, and that is, we have to look at litigation and legislation, I think, as a package. And that is because we need to concentrate on this, what look like the small things. And when I say the small things, I say the definition of significance by the FAA. The FAA looks upon the definition of significant noise as above 65 dNL. But as we know, dNL is an average. And as one of my very close friends said to me early on when we were forming our own group in the city of Newport Beach, if you sit on a chair and someone plants a bomb, but the noise is averaged over 24 hours, there is no noise. But on a single event basis, it will kill you. And that's what we're looking at here. We need to change the definition of significance. As Steve, the prior speaker, correctly stated, the FAA has shown no willingness. That's where legislation comes in. Obviously, the FAA has the power to make regulation, but only insofar as the scope of the legislation allows it. Therefore, we need to have something like, on the citizens' side, the Airport Noise Capacity Act, which was all for the airlines. Now we need to have citizens' legislation that will give us a true definition of significance for the purpose of ascertaining what is and what is not a result of that airport noise from a medical perspective. So I would say that the definition of significance is the critical variable here.
All right, appreciate it. And Elizabeth, thank you.
So I am going to concur with both of my colleagues and say this is the good news, bad news area. I completely agree that focusing on small portions of regulation and implementing legislation is going to be the manner to fix these different types of problems. I'm also going to concur that in this political environment, it's likely to be very difficult, even with FAA reauthorization, to get things through this Congress. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, and I don't know if it's good news, bad news, is that we have both micro and macro problems here. And the major problem, the elephant in the room, is we should be able to get through Congress. Saying that it's not going to happen, we can't get things through Congress politically, it's not, it is a sea change. We used to be able to have folks on both the Republican and the Democratic side work together and come to compromises and doing different types of things. So that means mobilizing at a macro level and working on other types of things. I like to start, since we have a specific defining issue here, and that is not just noise, but aviation noise, is look at who in Congress currently is working on noise. And you very wisely brought Eleanor Holmes Norton to the table, who has been a proponent of noise and introduced a lot of legislation that has not gone through. One of Representative Holmes' problems is that she's from the District of Columbia, and she is a shadow representative. She does not have the same voting authority or the other authorities in Congress that other folks have. So one of the things that happens is that, getting DC states' rights, which is sort of a far field from noise, but having things like DC states' rights so that the folks who are in fact impacted by noise in the District of Columbia, in addition to Maryland and Virginia, have representation in Congress. So that would be one of the things, using tools in terms of going to the folks who have signed legislation in things and advocating to the people who have already signed on to noise legislation is going to be important in terms of lobbying efforts. If you look at the various noise legislation that's been proposed, there have not been a lot of advocates, which is why I'm not tremendously hopeful about having legislative changes, but it's an incremental different types of approach. So starting with legislation, having tweaks to the legislation to make it politically more possible, I guess would be the best words, or expedient would be one thing in terms of going and doing it and coming to different types of consensus. The other thing, as the public health advocate in the room, is that we don't have in this country right now very good sense of deference to public health authorities in any way, shape, or form. COVID-19 has run ragged right now on the public health industry. We, as public health professionals, have not necessarily responded the way we should have or the most efficiently in terms of doing that. But we can't get consensus on even basic things in very well-defined terms like COVID on how to come to solutions. And so having more deference to our public health authorities, having more consensus and working to have, working things across the aisle, things like clean air, clean water, noise should not be polarizing issues. They shouldn't be a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. I like to remind people that the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, when they were passed and signed into law by President Nixon, who also created US EPA, they were bipartisan and they were almost universal. I can't remember which was completely universal and which had one dissenting vote. But working back toward that and having a sense that we all are entitled to certain public health. We're entitled to drink clean water. We're entitled to breathe clean air. We're entitled to not have such a noisy environment that we can't sleep. You know, those are entitlements, and that means that there's going to be sea changes on everybody's part, that everybody's going to have to give up certain personal liberties. You may not be able to take a flight at the time that you want because the airport may be shut down. You may have to take more rail because and invest in things like highways and high-speed rails instead of just the airline industry in order to do these different types of things. So I think that there are strategies here. I think it's a long-term strategy, and I think that it's going to be very difficult in this Congress. But the window that we have in this Congress is without a doubt the Reauthorization Act.
If I may, Todd, just jump back in here. One of the things that in order to be more specific with the legislation is you have to have something that is very, very specific. For example, standards, noise standards that apply to across the nation, enforceable noise standards, that sort of thing. And the more you can make specific asks to Congress and to the legislators who are for whom this is an important issue, the more likely it is that those will be included in the Reauthorization Act. And just to Barbara's point about the 65 DNL, while the DNL has been the sole measure since the 70s for FAA, what we should be looking at is a basket of different metrics. DNL may be appropriate in some instances, but certainly not appropriate in all instances. And so that's another thing to be looking at in terms of a modification of rulemaking, since that's an FAA rule rather than the statute. And certainly, as I've been seeing in the comments, refunding the EPA noise office, as well as revitalizing the Noise Control Act of 1972 should be also on the list of to-do items.
And that's the authorizations and appropriations is enormously important. We've seen cycles of this over the years. So in the Reagan era, US EPA was defunded. And so even though we had laws on the books, there wasn't an ability to have any kinds of enforcement. Under the Trump years, we had massive defunding of EPA all across the board, and a lot of the public health area, things like CDC as well. And if we don't have money to fund enforcement authorities, there will be no enforcement. So appropriations is extraordinarily boring. People don't spend a lot of time on focusing on appropriations bills, which happen regularly, but making sure that EPA's office on noise is in fact funded, actually EPA across the things, EPA for air pollution. One of the things that we get into right now is air pollution is looking at PM10 and PM2.5. There are no regulations on very fine particulates. Having money in air and the air authorities at EPA is also going to be important, whether that is promulgating additional regulation, which is possible, or amending the Clean Air Act, which is less possible. But it starts with having funding to do it.
Yes, and from a practical perspective, having been a lobbyist, and I hate to be too obvious, but the important thing in passing legislation which will satisfy the various interests is to get the support of FAA's funding, that is to say, the House Aviation Subcommittee. If you can do that, you got, you can't do it, you got nothing. So there are some very, very important practical perspectives here that have to be dealt with. But the narrower the bill is in terms of focus on noise metrics or significance levels, the better your chance of passing it. And if you get the support of the right people, it's really good. So we can't go in there and complain. We have to go in there and give them the bill we want passed.
Exactly. And the language, specific language that needs to be done, the more specific, you're 100% correct.
All right, well, thank you all for that. I'm going to give a compound question and we'll go in the order of Elizabeth, Barbara, Stephen for the last part here. And I think I'm going to guess that there's a couple of things on folks' minds. And so we're just going to put them together here and give everybody one more shot at it. The first part of the question is litigation. Should we be suing people? Can that get us anywhere? Is litigation a good option? And then the second, and that may sort of overlap a little bit, but what are the most promising areas? When looking forward to this solutions conference, thinking with your legal hats on, what litigation might be an option, but it might not be in the mix. And so we've heard a little bit already, but what are the most promising areas? I'll turn that over to Elizabeth.
Well, the answer again is yes and no. I don't love litigation as a general solution because courts are unpredictable. They rarely do specifically what you're asking, and you can get into issues of having things, as one of our prior speakers do, it blowing back on the folks who are making the plaintiffs who are making the complaints. Where and the issue here is when we're talking aircraft noise, there's different targets in terms of solutions, practical solutions. When you're talking about commercial helicopters flying over Manhattan versus tourist helicopters flying over Manhattan versus commercial aircraft versus military aircraft, the political solution and the solutions in terms of litigation and what authority you're going to be suing are going to be different. Military aircraft, I don't think you're going to have a lot of luck of litigation, period, because there's so much deference for DOD and training exercises and things like that. Helicopter litigation, that may be a different matter. And even though FAA is usually the source, the way I would be attacking things with helicopters is looking at zoning laws. Once the helicopters are in the air, it becomes a matter and jurisdiction of federal and the FAA. But when they're on the ground, where they have to land and take off, when they're getting licensing, that is a matter of business licensing and zoning. And so that may be the better litigation avenue is this appropriate zoning in an area in terms of what's going on in that. And so that type of a thing. I think the answer is going to be in terms of litigation is very similar to legislation. What you need is specific. You're not likely, I don't believe, to get groundswell legislation that's going to change the FAA or that's going to knock out a particular part of legislation that's going to really solve this problem. But you may have local litigation in local courts dealing with local matters that could give some relief.
Well, I would bring up one, I think, very important issue that we have suffered from not understanding at the early years and now understanding perfectly. You don't sue a federal agency for what it has done,
right?
Badly or not. You sue it for what it has not done.
Correct.
And we just won a case along with the city of Los Angeles last July because the FAA had completely declined to do any environmental review of flight path changes over the city of Los Angeles. Now, if they had done it, but done it badly, we would have lost, because the court gives entire deference to federal agencies in the course of their duties. So one must be very, very careful about the subject matter of your litigation, but you can prevail under very rare circumstances. And
yeah, the problem with litigation is that there are very few arrows in our quiver as litigators to go after aircraft noise. Certainly not like with any other the environmental issues like air or water or toxic substances. where there are specific sections of the statute that allow you to go after a generator of a particular type of pollution. So what we've been reduced to is using NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, as a method of litigating against the FAA and for airport expansion. And this is an imperfect way of going about it, simply because NEPA is a procedural act and not a substantive act. In other words, they have to do a checklist, and if they complete all the matters on the checklist, then the court will say they're done. You lose communities, and this sort of goes to what Barbara was saying, the fact that what had happened was that the FAA didn't complete their checklist. They forgot to do an item, and so that allowed an opening. The other thing is that there is the state litigation in terms of tort measures of nuisance and trespass, which have been used in the past successfully, but mostly those kinds of cases are not successful. And there are also instances of takings where the noise or the emission becomes so bad that the claim is made that the federal government or the airport authority has taken the property. But again, that is not that's not really a viable litigation strategy. And so this sort of leads back into the legislative side is in order for us to be successful in court, we need laws that we can enforce in court against the FAA to make sure that the FAA takes into account the people on the ground, whether that means separating the FAA from separating its ability to regulate aviation noise and emissions from its other duties with respect to air traffic, or developing enforceable noise standards so that when these noise standards are violated, we can go to court and get action, get court action. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of litigation. I've always been trying to come up with creative ways of trying to attack the FAA, whether that's through developing a petition for rulemaking, constitutional issues in terms of a right to sleep, making those kinds of arguments. But those are they're not going to go anywhere as well as a statutory provision that says that you can go after the FAA or the airport authority or the airlines for the noise that's being created.
All right, all, and I know that we're running over in general, but this panel's 8 minutes under time. So what I want to do is we'll still leave everybody 5 minutes under time. If I can get one last lightning round from each of you, and we'll start with Barbara since you haven't had a chance to go first. Looking ahead to the solutions thing that's coming next, what would you put forward as your one best thing that we might discuss or think about as a solution at a later date?
Legislation.
Admirably terse.
Say that again.
I said admirably terse. Thank you. Legislation. We should be thinking about it. Elizabeth.
I agree. Although I'm pessimistic that we're going to get legislation immediately, I think that legislation is going to be the key. And so having a concentrated approach where you're educating legislatures as well as the public and have efforts to support people who are going to go into Congress who are amenable to these kinds of public health issues. So one of the things that was talked about, earlier in the things is the environmental justice implications. And this administration has an emphasis on environmental justice, and many of the communities, if not most, that are impacted by aircraft noise are also environmental justice communities. Now that again goes back to my good news, bad news. We saw incredible documentation by scientific data on the health effects of noise. And the issue is that that is on top of other health effects that are felt by environmental justice, or really environmental injustice communities. So what you see is that in the United States, the #1 predictor of health is zip code, okay, period. The #1 predictor of health in the United States is zip code. And so what you see in these communities that are impacted very often is that there's a whole basket of issues that need to be addressed in terms of health. Noise is among them. And so addressing the basket of things and creating an environment where there is a right to good health, and that we have things like healthcare available for people and good housing, affordable housing, housing in areas that aren't noisy, all these different types of things go in together. And focusing on environmental justice as one of the implications on how to do it can be helpful. It's also difficult because you start getting into things away from noise whenever you're looking at these environmental justice communities.
All right, thank you. And Stephen.
Yes, I think the one thing is enforceable noise standards. And by the same token, push the EPA to make standards for hazardous air pollutants, particularly the hazardous air pollutants that are emitted by aircraft. Since the focus has always been on criteria air pollutants, which more or less aren't emitted in any great amounts by aircraft, and the emphasis should be more on getting standards for hazardous air pollutants that are created by aircraft. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, is enforceable noise standards, so that there is a mechanism to hold the airlines and the airports and the FAA accountable for the noise that they've created, and that's been done in some of the other areas, other area modes of transportation, but has not been done in the aviation world.
Well, and that goes to funding too, is going back to Build Back Better and building other infrastructure that means that there may be less demand for aircraft. We have economic means to have less flights, things like high-speed rails.
That's longer term than trying to get an enforceable noise standard put in a piece of legislation, which has been done, could be done. As I mentioned earlier, we have to expand that average noise metric to a single event noise metric, because that's what causes health problems.
All right, thank you all. We yield the remainder of our time, approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds, to the excellent gentleperson from the state of Massachusetts. Jamie, take over.
Yeah, I don't know, is Arlene Bronzap still here? I can't see her on the screen. Arlene?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, you are
listening.
Are closing. I do have one question, if I may, before we close out and before you have your remarks and Trish has her remarks, and I promise we'll be quick. One of our objects today was to really have these connections made between the science, what communities are experiencing, to kind of set the stage for what we can do going forward, either legislatively or through other solutions. And as mentioned, we'll be talking about that in October. I'd like to not ask people to speak necessarily, but maybe put some comments in the chat as to whether this conference did this. If we did, great. If we didn't, what gaps might we fill that, where there were things missing, and we can certainly consider that for things going forward. So anyway, that was my remark. So I'll turn it over to Arlene and then Trish.
Thank you. I'm going to state what Dr. Munsell said. There is no doubt that noise causes cardiovascular and cerebral damage. That's a strong statement, and I thank him. And now I'm going to go to costs. We always say that it costs money to remedy noise problems. Actually, it did cost the New York City Transit Authority some money to correct the problem on the rail. But when they spent those dollars, it actually put less stress on the rail and the structure, and it saved them money. It also saved the city money, and that children who are a year behind in reading, and if they had continued with the noise near their schools, they'd even have more children behind in reading. And guess what? That cost money. And the cardiovascular disorders that Dr. Monsell talked about, and the cerebral damage, if you're going to try to get medical assistance for that, that costs money. Now, who bears the burden of the costs to remediate learning deficiencies? Who bears the cost of money for cerebral damage and cardiovascular disorders? The citizens of this country. We are spending a lot of money on trying to help the people, even the people who talked about suffering from noise. Those people are probably reporting to their doctors, to their psychologists, their psychiatrists, and that's cost money. So I want us to remember that by not correcting the problem of aircraft noise and its impact on the people who are suffering from this overhead noise, this costs dollars. To me, it's more important that it's costing their health. But we're living in a nation that does focus on money. And that's the argument that the airlines are using, that the airports are using. So I would like to stress that we don't forget that by not correcting the air pollution and noise problems, our country is spending far more than we realize. And the people who are bearing that cost are you and me. So yes, there is no doubt that noise causes cardiovascular and cerebral damage. And with no doubt, then we should recognize that we need to correct the problem, or we'll continue to spend millions of dollars and allow people to suffer and even die from the adverse impacts of air pollution and noise. Thank you.
Arlene, thank you so much. And that provides an excellent segue, into the follow-up to this discussion coming up in October 13th. We'll send out information to everyone. So we hope you'll be able to join us so we can discuss solutions spurred by the discussion today. I want to thank the panelists for their exceptional and very compelling presentations and testimonies. Aviation noise is just one piece of the important story about how noise and related pollution are damaging health and the environment. But as you heard today, it's an urgent piece, and Quiet Communities is dedicated to spurring action that can affect change and protect the lives of Americans and the global community, so that quiet is not just a luxury, but something we can all enjoy daily. Lastly, I just want to add that as Quiet Communities nears its 10-year anniversary mark, we're at an inflection point. Each of our 5 volunteer-run programs, Quiet American Skies, this one, Quiet Outdoors, Quiet Healthcare, Quiet Conversation, and Quiet Coalition, are poised to affect real change. But this progress relies on contributions from generous donors. If you like what we do and want to be a part of this important effort, visit our website, quietcommunities.org, to learn about ways you can engage, and please consider a donation. Thank you all so very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
panelists.
James.
Okay.
Thank you, Jamie.
Have a great day, everybody. Look forward to
Everyone.
the next time.
Stay well.